Hey everyone, this is a piece by Kevin Anderson titled Raya Dunayevskaya 1910 to 1987, Marxist economist and philosopher. The abstract says Raya Dunayevskaya's theory of state capitalism, first developed in the 1940s as an analysis of Stalin's Russia, is here related to her subsequent work from 1953 to 1987 on Hegel, on Marxist humanism, and on Marxism and feminism. Dunayevskaya's concept of Hegel's, quote, absolute negativity as new beginning, end quote, is connected to her voluminous writings on Marx's major works, 1844 essays, Grundrisse, Capital, Ethnological Notebooks. Contrast and comparisons are drawn to the writings of others on these issues, including Lange, James, I guess it's Lange, James, Marcuse, Geras, Markovic, Rosdolsky, Krader, and Shanin. That's the end of the abstract. Raya Dunayevskaya's sudden death on June 9, 1987 was a tremendous loss to Marxist thought in the United States and worldwide. Russian-born Dunayevskaya came from a generation with direct links both to the Russian Revolution and to the battles against Stalinism in the 1930s, when she served as Trotsky's Russian secretary. Dunayevskaya went on to develop a theory of state capitalism in the 1940s and a philosophy of Marxist humanism beginning in the 1950s. Dunayevskaya leaves behind 4 books and over 10,000 pages of other writings on Marxian and revolutionary thought, much of the latter on deposit at Wayne State University Archives of Labor and Urban Affairs in Detroit as the Raya Dunayevskaya collection. In the last months of her life, she had been working on a book project entitled Dialectics of Organization and Philosophy, the quote, party, and new forms arising out of spontaneity. Dunayevskaya, 1988, which will now sadly remain unfinished. Since it is clearly impossible to cover here the rich totality of Dunayevskaya's work, I will concentrate on 2 key issues in her theoretical writings: state capitalism and Marx's humanism. State capitalism. I don't know why I said I. Having broken with Trotsky, who continued to consider Stalin's Soviet Union to be a, quote, workers' state, though degenerate, end quote, even as the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939 paved the way for World War II, Dunayevskaya began from 1941 on to elaborate a theory of state capitalism under the pen name Freddie Forest. In this period, Dunayevskaya worked with a colleague, the Trinidad-born theorist C.L.R. James, who wrote under the name J.R. Johnson. Dunayevskaya's and James's Johnson-Forest tendency continued in several political forms, both inside and then outside Trotskyism, until 1955, when irreconcilable theoretical differences arose between Dunayevskaya and James. After 1955, Dunayevskaya developed her own concept of Marxist humanism alone, establishing the paper News and Letters, while James became a Pan-Africanist and a supporter of Third World nationalist regimes such as Nkrumah's Ghana. In the 1960s, Mao's designation of the Soviet Union as state capitalist made state capitalism into a virtual cliché, but that does not detract from the historic originality of Dunayevskaya's concept of state capitalism, first worked out in the 1940s. Unfortunately, the now numerous academic accounts of these developments are sketchy and often inaccurate. Cleaver, 1979, I'm going to assume he means Harry Cleaver, caught much of the originality of various Johnson-Forest concepts, although Cleaver was apparently misled at the time into crediting James alone with jointly worked out writings and ideas. In an otherwise tendentious appraisal, one recent Australian study does recognize that, quote, of the two, Dunayevskaya performed the more detailed analysis of Hegel, Marx, and the USSR, end quote. That's Peter Bailhart's, whose books like that I was actually just reading before I started reading this, or not. I wasn't reading the book, but I was reading a section from the book just now, just 10 minutes ago. His book on Trotsky. Earlier, Jerome and Buick had traced various Marxian theories of state capitalism, noting that Dunayevskaya, quote, was the first to provide a detailed analysis of any length of the meaning and function of state capitalism in the USSR, end quote. I don't know who the Jerome person is, but the person who wrote the piece in question here is Adam Buick. Adam Buick has some really good pieces on this channel, and I really recommend looking at his work. Unfortunately, Jerome and Buick were seemingly unaware that James and Dunayevskaya had diverged in 1955. Dunayevskaya's own retrospective accounts stresses her difference with James even in the 1940s, albeit not directly over the concept of state capitalism. As Jerome and Buick noted, Dunayevskaya's analysis was empirical and detailed, painstakingly worked out from very sketchy and sometimes deliberately contradictory official USSR statistics. Her three-part series of articles published in 1942 to 43 in the Marxist theoretical journal New International offered one of the first detailed accounts anywhere of the terrible famine of the 1930s as well as overall labor conditions in Stalin's Russia. Dunayevskaya concluded, for example, that by 1937 the real wages of Russian workers had decreased to half their 1928 levels and that unexpectedly low population figures from the 1939 census seemed to indicate that over 15 million people had perished in the 1930s. I think I might be really dehydrated. The conclusion to this series on the concept of state capitalism was not published until 1946 to 47, apparently due to resistance from the editorial board of New International, then dominated by Max Shachtman, who held a bureaucratic collectivist position on the nature of the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, the articles drew wide attention among the, quote, New York intellectuals, end quote, of the period. Arthur Koestler, at that time still on the left, used them for his own analysis, Soviet Myth and Reality, originally published in 1945. In her 1946 to 47 conclusions to the articles, Dunayevskaya took as her point of departure the discussion by Marx in Capital Volume 1 that even if the market were replaced by planning in a centralized, quote, single capitalist, end quote, controlled the economy, it would not affect the underlying law of value and surplus value. She concluded that Stalin's USSR took the form of such a totally centralized, quote, single capitalist society, end quote. The fetishism of commodities had been replaced by the fetishism of state property. Quote, state capitalism brings about a change in the mode of appropriation. As has occurred so often in the lifespan of capitalism, through its competitive monopoly and state monopoly stages, ... This pressure in Russia is exerted not through competition, but state planning, end quote. Yeah, I'd be pretty skeptical. This is a side note. This is a sentence that says the fetishism of commodities have been replaced by the fetishism of state property. I feel like if the USSR, and I'm not sure what, I don't really have like too much of a strong, concretized opinion myself. But the notion that the fetishism of commodities would be replaced in a state capitalist society, not that there's also like not that the fetishism of state property in the Soviet Union was there, and but this notion of the fetishism of commodities in some place some sense being replaced under state capitalism seems odd to me. Seems like an odd formulation, but anyway, back to the text. Dunayevskaya constructed a detailed portrait not only of the conditions of labor, but also of the structure of the new ruling class. From the beginning, Dunayevskaya's analysis based itself explicitly on Marxist dialectics as well as economics, developing, for example, one of the first discussions anywhere of Marx's 1844 essays in an introduction to the analysis of the USSR entitled Labor and Society, written in 1942 and refused publication by New International. She quoted Marx's view of individuality, quote, "It is especially necessary to avoid ever again to counterpose, quote, society, end quote, as an abstraction to the individual, end quote, in order to attack the view that Stalin's collectivizations were historically progressive. Because of her knowledge of Russian, she had access not only to Soviet economic data and theoretical discussion, but perhaps even more important, to works of Marx which were not available to English or even German readers until later decades. Dunayevskaya was especially concerned with Marxist theory, not only as the underpinning of her own analysis of the Soviet economy, but also as a critique of Stalinist ideology. This became critical when she translated a key 1943 article, Teaching of Economics in the Soviet Union, where official Soviet ideologists had written that, quote, denying the operation of the law of value in socialist society created insurmountable difficulties, end quote, and that instead they had developed a more satisfactory, quote, premise that under socialism the law of value functions, end quote. Leontiev et al., 1944. Dunayevskaya published the translation of the article in the American Economic Review, where she wrote an incisive analysis of it from a state capitalist vantage point. Dunayevskaya singled out as well the Soviet ideologist's proposal to teach capital, Marx's capital, in chronological order, a step which she considered to be a violation of its dialectical structure. After Baron, 1944, Lange, 1945, and Rogin, 1945, each wrote sharply critical responses, Dunayevskaya's own rejoinder stressed that with the admission that the law of value still operated, quote, Soviet economic theory finally reflects state capitalist economic reality, end quote. Dunayevskaya, 1945. Dunayevskaya held that the Russian article reflected a revision of Marxism, which could then function as a new state ideology for continued capital accumulation in the post-war period. The lengthy 1950 statement, State Capitalism and World Revolution, which was signed, quote, Johnson Forrest, end quote, has been recently reissued as a book with the authorship given as C.L.R. James, quote, written in collaboration with Raya Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee, end quote. However, this book lacks the detailed economic analysis of the writings on state capitalism which Dunayevskaya wrote alone. Dunayevskaya developed a new Marxist humanist dialectic in the period 1953 to 57. This emerged out of her studies of Hegel as well as the early and mature Marx, which took her beyond the concept of dialectics underpinning the Marxism of the Johnson Forrest tendency. The fullest development of her own concept of state capitalism is in Marxism and Freedom, originally published in 1958, where the detailed economic analysis is presented within an overall humanist dialectic, which also stresses mass resistance to Stalinism inside the Soviet Union itself. Far from only a USSR phenomenon, this discussion saw state capitalism as a new world stage of the development of capitalism as a whole, following its earlier competitive and monopoly stages. Quote, state capitalism is not a continuous development of capitalism in the sense of a development without breaks. It is a development through transformation into opposite. Capitalism lived and progressed by free competition. Hence, capitalism found its fullest development under democratic, bourgeois, or parliamentary democracy. State capitalism means, and can only mean, bureaucracy, tyranny, and barbarism as could have been seen in Nazi Germany and can be seen in totalitarian Russia. One would have to be blind not to see the elements of it everywhere, including the United States, end quote. Dunayevskaya. Elements of state capitalism in America encompassed, on the other hand, the New Deal state intervention into the economy, and on the other, the rise of the military and police apparatus of the modern American system, today termed the national security state. In addition, Dunayevskaya now stressed that state capitalism, east or west, engendered forms of social resistance, especially by workers. Dunayevskaya entitled her 1958 discussion in Marxism and Freedom, quote, "The Problem of Our Age, State Capitalism versus Freedom," end quote, and divided it into two sections, one on Russia and the other on America. Dunayevskaya developed an intricate analysis for Marx's Capital, showing that plan and market are not true opposites, and arguing that alienated labor, not planlessness, is the hallmark of capitalism. This brought her to a reappropriation of Marx's concept of commodity fetishism for the theory of state capitalism. Quote, "In Russia, where the society is completely state capitalist, the bourgeois fetishism of commodities seems to be overcome. In a sense, it is. The Russian bureaucrats are not affected by problems of the market, nor confused by ideas of equal exchange, as are the bourgeois economists." End quote. But Dunayevskaya contended commodity fetishism was for Marx rooted not in the market, but rather in production relations. Quote, "But another aspect of fetishism, the critical aspect that Marx uncovered, was the perversity of relations between machine and man, where dead labor dominates over living labor. That is why Marx is so insistent in saying that the form of the commodity is fantastic, not because it is not true, but because it correctly reflects the real relations at the point of production." Since the Soviet ruling class is not and could not have abolished alienated labor, quote, "This fetishism not only has not been overcome in Russia, the plan has perfected it and become a prisoner of it. They have substituted for fetishism of commodities the fetishism of the plan. But their plan turns out to be no more than a disguise for the actual relations of production in the factory. ... In reality, therefore, the state plan is nothing but the organization of the proletariat to produce under the domination of the machine." End quote. Dunayevskaya grounded the above analysis in the 1944-45 controversy over the teaching of economics in the Soviet Union. Dunayevskaya now gave greater stress to how the Soviet ideologist Leontiev et al. In 1944 had, in addition to admitting that the Marxian law of values still operated in the Soviet Union, set up a new framework for teaching capital, Marx's Capital, which skipped the first chapter on commodities with its section on fetishism altogether, and began instead with the historical section on primitive accumulation. That makes me actually think of two things. First, that's precisely, I think that attitude of the skipping over the initial chapters on commodities is something that I believe that was like advocated by Althusser, for being like too Hegelian or something like that. And I'm not exactly sure about that, but I'm just drawing connections for myself. And also, the starting with the historical section on primitive accumulation is also how, I don't know if it's how reading Capital politically is organized, but definitely Harry Cleaver's 33 Lessons on Capitalism kind of starts the same way. It like starts with, it doesn't skip the chapters on commodity at all, but it starts with, it like kind of like skips ahead to the historical part of Marx's Capital Volume 1 about so-called primitive accumulation. Dunayevskaya noted later that this Stalinist proposal anticipated Althusser's essentially similar one by over 20 years. See? Man, I'm hip to it, dude. The revision of the dialectical form of Capital, the book, had to occur because, she writes, quote, "No Russian worker could see the difference between his, quote, socialist labor," end quote, and that which was described by Marx as capitalism, alienated labor. The questions asked by students were likewise unanswerable, hence the teaching of political economy was stopped altogether, end quote. Dunayevskaya. These problems necessitated the changes in teaching economics. In Marxism and Freedom, Dunayevskaya continued the type of detailed analysis of the Soviet economy which she had done in the 1940s, but her new Marxist humanist standpoint now placed a broad critique of the state capitalist plan at its center. Quote, the experience of Russia since 1936 has exploded the idea that planning by any other class than the proletariat can ever reverse the law of motion of capitalist society, end quote. This critique of the plan was applied as well to the new U.S. industrial relations specialist. Quote, this is the fact from which all contemporary sociology and social psychology begins, the rejection by the workers of all the old capitalist controls and standards, end quote. Both American wildcat strikes and East European revolts were seen as examples of resistance to state capitalism. That's something, if you don't know, I'm pretty sure with Dunayevskaya, I don't know how long it lasted, but in the 1950s, there was pretty close collaboration between Dunayevskaya and Cornelius Castoriadis. I think the book Facing Reality is by, I don't know if it's, I think it might be by James, or signed by James Dunayevskaya and Castoriadis together. Yeah. Dunayevskaya continued her writings on state capitalism after the 1950s. Her 1959/1961 study of Afro-Asian revolutions extended the concept to the Third World, where the new nations were hemmed in by a bipolar world dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, and their leaders faced the temptation of state capitalist planning from above, whether in India, in Africa, or most of all in China. Another important discussion critiqued Luxemburg's accumulation theory, Bukharin's writings on transition, and analyzed Mao's China as a state capitalist society. Later came the chapter on state capitalism and the East European revolts in Philosophy and Revolution, and many more recent discussions on Poland's Solidarność, or on Andropov and Gorbachev in News and Letters. I believe Andropov was the general secretary of, or the head of the Soviet Union, in for a very brief period in the early 1980s. I think he was after Brezhnev. New section. Marx's Humanism, Dialectics and Economics. Beginning in the 1950s, Dunayevskaya grappled directly with Hegelian dialectics, having been drawn into this subject when in 1948 she made a translation of Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks for her colleagues C.L.R. James and Grace Lee. By 1953, shortly before their parting of the ways, Dunayevskaya wrote 2 substantial letters to Grace Lee on the dialectic in Hegel's absolutes and their varying forms in 3 of his major works, The Phenomenology of Spirit, Science of Logic, and Philosophy of Mind. In particular, she brought out for the first time by any Marxist the liberatory potential of Hegel's concept of, quote, self-thinking idea, end quote, which he ended the philosophy of mind. Dunayevskaya tied this concept to the new social movements which arose after World War II, blacks, rank-and-file labor, women, and youth. Dunayevskaya saw the new social movements as the type of self-development of the revolutionary subject that the state capitalist age had ushered in, using Hegel's self-thinking idea to characterize the new movements, not only as the, quote, self-bringing forth of freedom, end quote, but also as a movement from practice, quote, which is itself a form of theory, end quote. This was developed first in the 1953 letters and later in her books, beginning with Marxism and Freedom. To be sure, Dunayevskaya saw Hegel's central contribution to be his dialectic of, quote, freedom and of, quote, negativity, but unlike other Marxists such as Herbert Marcuse, 1941, or Georg Lukács, 1975, Dunayevskaya plunged directly into Hegel's absolutes as the source of her own, quote, revolutionary dialectics, end quote. She grounded her Marxist humanism in what she termed, quote, absolute negativity as new beginning, end quote. In her paper presented to the Hegel Society of America, Dunayevskaya began by quoting Hegel's Science of Logic on the absolute idea, quote, containing the highest opposition in itself, end quote, stressing the open character of Hegel's dialectic even at the level of his absolute idea. Sometimes linked to critical theory or existential Marxism, the heterogeneous development of Marxist humanism based itself on the humanist content of Marx's work, especially the early Marx. All of the key Marxist humanists also opposed established communism. From 1961 to 1965, Kolakowski, I think he was the guy who wrote I don't think he remained a Marxist. Maybe he did, but he wrote that book, like one of the big books that's like a history of Marxism, the main currents in Marxism book. It's like 3 volumes. I don't know if I have any of his pieces on here. I don't know. But Zvitak, I have something from him on the channel, 1970. Markovic, I have 2 pieces from him. I have Karl Kosik, 1978. I have something from Carl. I guess it's Carl. I don't know if it's Carl or Carol Kosik, but yeah. But I have pieces from all those people. But yeah, all of the key Marxist humanists also opposed established communism, sometimes as state capitalism. Recently, another writer and I have stressed that Marxist humanism. Recently, another writer and I have stressed that Marxist humanism can be considered to have important differences from critical theory and existential Marxism. See J. 1985 and Anderson 1986. Dunayevskaya's contribution to Fromm's socialist humanism, which I have a bunch of entries from on this channel, and 2 histories which she wrote of the development of her own concept of Marxist humanism, show her relationship to these sources of Marxist humanism. Where other Marxist humanists centered their work around studies of the young Marx and the dialectic in an Eastern European context, a lot of them were associated. A lot of these people who were Marxist humanists are associated with the Yugoslav Praxis school. Like all those people that I mentioned, I think are all from that. Like I think Zvitak and Markovic, Kosik, like maybe not Yugoslav, but like Eastern European. Like Kolakowski was Polish. Zvitak, I'm not sure what he was. Markovic, I think, was Yugoslavian. Well, he was Yugoslavian. And then Kosik, I believe, is Czechoslovakian. Anyway, back to the text. Where other Marxist humanists centered their work around studies of the young Marx and the dialectic in an East European context, Dunayevskaya's version developed in a somewhat broader context, additionally out of a dialogue in the 1950s with both American civil rights and labor movements as well as the African liberation struggle. Especially by the 1960s, the writings on revolutionary humanism of Frantz Fanon. Dunayevskaya stressed that where the activist movements of the 1960s had tended to neglect theory altogether, in the 1950s new discussions of radical humanism had accompanied the actual revolts, especially in East Europe where new discussions of the young Marx were undertaken. In her chapter on East Europe in Philosophy and Revolution, Dunayevskaya conveyed the sweep of both the revolt and philosophical probing of East European Marxist humanists. In the 1970s, Althusserian and other variants of anti-humanist theorizing gained headway, but as one British theorist, Kate Soper, has noted, there is today, quote, a climate of opinion less susceptible than that of a decade ago to the lure of, quote, anti-humanist, end quote, Marxism, end quote. Even formerly, quote, anti-humanist, end quote, Marxists such as Norman Geras, now faced with the challenge of new post-Althusserian French trends terming themselves not only anti-humanist, but also, quote, post-Marxist, end quote, have addressed the issue of, quote, human nature, end quote, in Marx, while still keeping their distance not only from Hegel, but especially from the explicit, quote, new humanism, end quote, of Marx's 1844 essays. In a more recent debate with the, quote, post-Marxist, end quote, Laclau and Mouffe, Geras lists what he still evidently considered to be the, quote, standard Marxist positions, end quote. 1. Quote, class position is the primary historical determinant, end quote. 2. Quote, the metaphor of base and superstructure is a theoretically viable one, end quote. 3. Quote, the working class is an objective interest in socialism, end quote. 4. Quote, socialism, end quote, and not merely, quote, radical democracy, end quote, is the goal. 5. Quote, society and history can be rendered intelligible by some unifying principle, end quote. Geras, 1987. In short, class structure, socialism, and, quote, some unifying principle, end quote, dialectic structuralism, Geras does not say, are what Geras singles out to sum up Marx's worldview. In sharp contrast to Geras, Dunayevskaya offered a broad dialectical view of Marx in her brief discussion on what she termed, quote, the vision and the general principles of historical materialism, end quote. Quote, the material objective conditions of human existence, the self-development of labor, of the laborer, as against any, quote, objective, end quote, development of mind, the historical processes as against any, quote, eternal truths, end quote, dialectical development through contradictions as against any mechanical or abstract, contemplative, or merely empiric continuity of that which is as inseparable from the, quote, mature, end quote, Marx as from the young, end quote. Dunayevskaya. Increasingly, it is seen that only such a fully dialectical humanist Marxism can meet the challenge of today, whether from, quote, post-Marxist, end quote, or from new social movements themselves. Thus, Soper's 1986 Humanism and Anti-Humanism, while admittedly Sartrean in its emphasis, nonetheless gives a serious hearing to Marxist humanism, including Dunayevskaya's work. It says here that Kate Soper is a British philosopher. Soper is the author of and contributor to over a dozen books on feminism, continental philosophy, addressing the works of Jean-Paul Sartre, Karl Marx, and Simone de Beauvoir, among others. Soper's other contributions have been to consumption theory and environmental philosophy. She is a critic of post-structuralist feminism. Anyway. Thus, Kate Soper's 1886 Humanism and Anti-Humanism, while admittedly Sartrean in its emphasis, nonetheless gives a serious hearing to Marxist humanism, including Dunayevskaya's work. Soper develops an explicit critique of the anti-humanist thought of Althusser, Foucault, and Derrida. In order to do so, Kate Soper takes a journey into the young Marx and Hegel's phenomenology, but stops short of any consideration of Hegel's absolute knowledge as anything other than a, quote, plateau, end quote, arguing contra Dunayevskaya that, quote, philosophy cannot start with the absolute, end quote. As against Geras, however, this does not mean a turn completely away from Hegel, since in Soper's view, quote, it is not Feuerbach but Hegel whom Marx credits in the 1844 manuscripts with exposing, albeit only in its abstract and ahistoric development, the essential nature of this secular alienation, end quote. Nor does it mean any simplified concept of materialism, since in her view Marx is, quote, arguing for a humanism that unites idealism and materialism, end quote. C.J. Arthur, I have some work from Christopher Arthur on here. C.J. Arthur's 1986 Dialectics of Labor, another recent British study, relies partly on Dunayevskaya's interpretation of Marx's 1844 essays, although his overall perspective is drawn from that of Lukács. While, as Arthur notes, it is true that in his 1844 Critique of the Hegelian Dialectic, Marx praises Hegel for having Marx, quote, praises Hegel for having grasped man as the result of his own labor, end quote. Marx does not concentrate at all on the section on the master and the slave, but rather, quote, discusses the phenomenology as a whole and draws attention to its last chapter especially, end quote, the chapter on absolute knowledge. Arthur does note Marx's singling out from that chapter of the concept of, quote, absolute negativity, end quote, as Hegel's key contribution, but apparently following Lukács, he does not develop the point positively as to the relevance of absolute knowledge for Marxism today. These discussions within British Marxism in the 1980s show the growing importance of the question of humanism within contemporary Marxism, and in particular that of the Marxist humanism developed beginning in the 1950s by Dunayevskaya. In that light, let us proceed to examine some of her writings on Marx's humanism. The original edition in 1958 of Dunayevskaya's Marxism and Freedom contained her translation into English, the first published anywhere, of two of the most important of Marx's 1844 essays, Private Property and Communism, and Critique of the Hegelian Dialectic. Dunayevskaya focused on Marx's concept of labor in 1844. She considered labor as, quote, the first of all the function, end quote, of human beings. But, quote, under capitalism, end quote, the human being becomes, quote, a mere appendage, end quote, of the machine, quote, alienated labor, end quote, in contrast to, quote, the creative function it was under primitive communism, end quote. In the reading of Marx's 1844 critique of Hegel, the negative and critical character of Hegel's dialectic, which Marcuse had emphasized, is connected by Dunayevskaya to the positive moment of Marx's, quote, own philosophy of humanism, end quote, which, quote, stands to this day as the dividing line between Marxism as the doctrine of liberation and all who claim the name of, quote, Marxism, end quote, socialism or, quote, communism, end quote, while they pursue an utterly different course, end quote. Dunayevskaya stressed that Marx, quote, first called, end quote, his, quote, total outlook, not, quote, communism, but, quote, humanism, end quote, end quote. Dunayevskaya cited the young Marx who, in the essay Private Property and Communism, criticized a, quote, vulgar and unthinking communism, end quote, which, quote, completely negates the personality, end quote, of the human being. This led directly to her discussion of present-day established communism, which, quote, continues to spend incredible time and energy and vigilance to imprison Marx within the bounds of private property versus state property concept, end quote, where she accused Soviet ideologists of burying or distorting the humanistic content of Marx's work. In this sense, Marx's concept of alienation acquires a critical philosophy and political dimension. Marx's humanism, the positive and the negative of alienation, is what illuminates and drives the category of alienated labor here, rather than alienation alone standing as the centerpiece as in so many discussions of the 1844 essays, beginning with Marcuse's 1941 rigorous analysis of alienated labor and continuing through the somewhat abstract humanism of Fromm. Dunayevskaya's Philosophy and Revolution, published in 1973, argued that Marx's 1844 confrontation with Hegel's phenomenology, especially its final chapter, Absolute Knowledge, had made the reader, quote, witness to the origination of the Marxian dialectic, end quote. In Dunayevskaya's most recent analysis, it was not a question of so much of Hegel's, quote, influence, end quote, on Marx, as a question of what Marx developed out of Hegel, quote, which cannot be grasped by singling out, quote, influences, end quote, but by saying that the breaking point, emphasis added, the point of departure from the old becomes the translucent direction forward, end quote. The year 1844 therefore contains already the whole of Marx in the sense of a universal humanist dialectic, having been created in his essay, Critique of the Hegelian Dialectic, which she holds forms the basis for Marx's subsequent writings. Dunayevskaya argued that the Grundrisse and Critique of Political Economy actually had more directly Hegelian form than did the finished Capital. I think a lot of people would agree with that, or at least to the degree that they would at least agree that the more Hegelian moments of Capital that are like less concerned with, like, I don't know, there's some degree to which, the different first chapters of Capital underwent revisions on the basis of it being viewed as, too too confusing, too I don't know, too esoteric, and so like the journals were those chapters were kind of rendered more exoteric, and people find, especially I think value form people, generally tend to find a lot of richness in the Critique of Political Economy, or book, which I think is from like 1859. What was I gonna say? Yeah, I think people draw a lot out of it. I think like what's being said here about the layout of that piece being more Hegelian, or at least being more kind of like I don't know, developing the concept of value form and commodity fetishism. Certain aspects of that argument, at least, are more richly developed in Critique of Political Economy, or at least more coherent, or something like that. I don't know. But I think this thing that Dunayevskaya is saying here is things that people agree with. Anyway, despite Grundrisse's, quote, more total conception than the logical, precise Capital, end quote, and its, quote, tremendous world historic view, end quote, including Grundrisse's, quote, excursion into pre-capitalist societies, end quote, Dunayevskaya wrote, quote, the Grundrisse is proof of the limitation but also the indispensability of the dialectic. Dialectic is not a, quote, applied, end quote, science. The Marxian dialectic thus transcended and preserved the Hegelian dialectic. Until, however, the subject, i.e. the proletariat of the 1860s, acted, the strikes and revolts in Europe, the Civil War in the U.S., the Black Dimension, the dialectical analysis necessarily remained intellectualist, ... end quote. In this sense, Dunayevskaya later criticized Rosdolsky's 1977 near identification of Capital and Grundrisse, pointing to Metham's 1979 critique of Rosdolsky, while in no way agreeing with the downplaying of Hegel by either Metham or Rosdolsky. Dunayevskaya argued further that, quote, Capital, ... is the great divide from Hegel, and not just because the subject is economics rather than philosophy, end quote, but because the, quote, subject, no subject matter, end quote, of... I'm going to repeat that. Dunayevskaya argued further that, quote, Capital, ... is the great divide from Hegel, and not just because the subject is economics rather than philosophy, end quote, but because the, quote, subject, not the subject matter, end quote, of Capital, showed a continuity from Marx's humanism of 1844. The subject, Dunayevskaya showed, was, quote, the human being, end quote, the living worker faced with capital. Quote, this dialectic is therefore totally new, totally internal, deeper than ever was the Hegelian dialectic, which had dehumanized the self-development of humanity in the dialectic of consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason. Marx could transcend the Hegelian dialectic not by denying that it was the, quote, source of all dialectic, end quote. Rather, it was precisely because Marx began with that source that he could make the leap to the live subject, who is the one who transforms reality, end quote. Dunayevskaya. Dunayevskaya continued this argument in a detailed analysis of the relationship of Hegel's Science of Logic to the first chapter of Capital, concluding that where Hegel took over 500 pages to move from appearance to essence to notion, to quote notion, end quote, parenthesis, concept, end parenthesis, quote, what Marx confronts us with in the first chapter is not only appearance and essence, but notion, end quote. In this sense, she separated herself from Lenin's Philosophical Notebooks, which had stressed the strong affinities between the form of Capital and that of Hegel's logic. For Dunayevskaya, Marx's humanism was as much of the ground of volumes 2 and 3 as of volume 1 of Capital. In Marxism and Freedom, she quoted the following passage from volume 3 on going beyond, quote, the realm of necessity, end quote. Beyond it begins that development of human, quote, beyond the realm of necessity, begins the development of human power, which is its own end. The true realm of freedom, which, however, can flourish only upon the realm of necessity as its basis. The shortening of the working day is its fundamental premise. End quote. Dunayevskaya. Or Marx, quoted by Dunayevskaya. Then Dunayevskaya wrote, quote, thus we see it isn't only the young Marx, but the mature Marx to whom the creative role of labor is the key to all else, ... In the Grundrisse, Marx said that once the productive process, quote, is stripped of its antagonistic form, end quote, quote, the measure of wealth will then no longer be labor time, but leisure time, end quote. The free time liberated from capitalist exploitation would be for the free development of the individual's powers. The conception of freedom that the young Marx had when Marx broke from bourgeois society as a revolutionary Hegelian remained with him throughout his life, end quote. Dunayevskaya discerned this same thread of humanism as well in Marx's last writings, in which great interest has recently developed, especially on their relationship to the Third World. Shanin, I think it's Theodore Shanin, and his colleagues published in full and debated the drafts of Marx's 1881 letters on the Russian village commune Mir to Ferosasulych, while Lawrence Krader, I believe it's Lawrence Krader, made a painstaking transcription of Marx's Ethnological Notebooks on primitive and non-Western societies. Krader connected these writings mainly to Marx's concept of the Asiatic mode of production, while Shanin saw in them an affinity between Marx and Russian populism. Shanin and his colleagues downplayed the Hegel-Marx relationship while fiercely attacking Engels. Krader saw Hegelian and humanist dimensions to Marx's later writings, but downplayed Marx's differences there with Engels. Dunayevskaya's analysis of these issues, begun in 1979, saw not a separation but rather a continuity between the concerns of the late Marx and his work as a whole, a theme developed most fully in her 1982 book, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution. At the same time, the new element of Marx's Ethnological Notebooks led her to look again at Marx's earlier work. One feature which emerged anew here was Marx's relation to women's liberation. Not only did Dunayevskaya view the Ethnological Notebooks as a major statement by Marx on women, an issue largely ignored by both Krader and Shanin, but what she saw in the Ethnological Notebooks led her to a re-examination of the whole of Marx. From the 1844 Essays to Capital. She found a rich body of material on women's liberation. Where Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, it seemed to share the anthropologist Morgan's idyllic view of primitive society. Dunayevskaya saw Marx's notebooks as showing that, quote, on the contrary, ... elements of oppression in general, of women in particular, arose within primitive communism, and not only related to change from, quote, matriarchy, end quote, but beginning with the establishment of ranks, relationship of chief to mass, and the economic interest that accompanied it, end quote. Dunayevskaya. This led her in turn to a sharp critique of Engels to develop a concept of, quote, post-Marx Marxism, end quote, beginning with Engels, a term Dunayevskaya used as a pejorative. Quote, Engels' unilinear view led him to mechanical positivism, end quote. Dunayevskaya. Quote, Marx was not hurrying to make easy generalizations, such as Engels' characterization of the future being just a, quote, higher stage, end quote, of primitive communism. No, Marx envisioned a totally new man, a totally new woman, a totally new life form, and by no means only for marriage. In a word, a totally new society, end quote. Dunayevskaya. In this sense, the underlying theme of Marx's humanism emerges here in his last writings. A second element emerging out of her discussion of the late Marx was a new view of Marx and the Third World, where Engels evidently saw Marx's notes on anthropology as a study of the origins of class society. Dunayevskaya held that Marx, quote, drew no such unbridgeable gap between primitive and civilized as Engels had, end quote. And this concern was new revolutionary subjects in his own period. In the 1882 preface to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, co-authored with Engels, Marx, quote, projected the idea that Russia could be the first to have a proletarian revolution ahead of the West, end quote. Where Shanin sees this as a sharp break from Marx's earlier concept, Dunayevskaya took us through a new reading of Marx's earlier work. She noted, for example, that the French edition of Capital had taken up new material on imperialism. In addition, the section on commodity fetishism had contained a reference to China's Taiping peasant rebellion of the 1850s, which Marx contrasted to the post-1848 quiescence in Europe. In the last year of his life, she recalled, Marx traveled to Algiers, prompting Lafargue to write Engels, quote, Marx has come back with his head full of Africa and the Arabs, end quote. Cited in Dunayevskaya, 1982. This anticipation and offering of a revolutionary humanist ground for today's third world revolutions was another proof to Dunayevskaya of the actuality of Marx's humanism, made more explicit by the publication, almost 100 years after his death, of his last writings. In the conclusion of her Rosa Luxemburg book, Dunayevskaya wrote, quote, what is needed is a new unifying principle, on Marx's ground of humanism, that truly alters both human thought and human experience. Marx's ethnological notebooks are a historical happening that proves, 100 years after he wrote them, that Marx's legacy is no mere heirloom, but a live body of ideas and perspectives that is in need of concretization, end quote. Dunayevskaya. So too with the rich legacy of Raya Dunayevskaya. That's the end. What was I going to say? Yeah, there's some notes here. Some end notes. I'll read them. There's only a page. It says, I don't know, they're disconnected, so you'll just kind of have to guess. Maybe they'll acknowledge something that you remember from listening to me, but it says, this is especially true of the error-ridden British book, which actually has C.L.R. James, who lived from 1901 to 1989, as having died in 1976. 2. In a recent book by a writer who acknowledges his, quote, intellectual debt to C.L.R. James, end quote, in the preface, Boole, James in the 1940s is treated at length, especially on state capitalism, but Dunayevskaya is given a single mention. 3. For a late 1940s view by Dunayevskaya, see her book outline, State Capitalism and Marxism, sent at the time to Joan Robinson and included with Robinson's handwritten commentary in Dunayevskaya's papers. 4. Dunayevskaya argued these and other points with Ernest Mandel from the 1940s on. For two fairly recent discussions, see Dunayevskaya's sharp critique of his Introduction to Capital and their direct debate on Trotsky, 1977. I'd really like to actually see that, actually. 5. On China, see also her extensive analysis in the appendices to Marxism and Freedom, originally written in the 1960s. 6. Dunayevskaya's fullest discussion of this issue was in the first chapter of Philosophy and Revolution, and in her notes toward the unfinished book, Dialectics of Organization and Philosophy. For interesting critiques of her position on Hegel's absolutes and her responses, see her lengthy correspondence with Marcuse during the period 1954 to 78, and her dialogue with the non-Marxist Hegel scholar George Armstrong Kelly in the 1982 preface to Philosophy and Revolution and elsewhere. Endnote 7. To avoid confusion, I am using Dunayevskaya's own term, quote, Marxist humanism, end quote, to refer to her ideas, quote, Marxist humanism, end quote, to refer to the humanist content of Marx's own work, end quote, Marxist humanism, end quote, with no dash. The first one had a dash between Marxist and humanism, all caps, and quote, Marxist humanism, end quote, to refer to the broad group of Marxist humanist writings internationally after World War II. Endnote 8. Adrian Rich has recently discussed Dunayevskaya's contribution to feminist theory at length. See Dunayevskaya's response to Rich, 1988.